while I was fighting overseas, risking my life for my country. The HOA back home sold my land, my only inheritance, like it was theirs to take. But what they didn't know was that I'm a combat logistics officer with friends in very high places, and I was about to repossess their entire neighborhood, military style. I was 6 months into my deployment when I got the email that changed everything. At the time, I was stationed in Eastern Europe, working 12-hour shifts coordinating military supply routes across NATO bases. Life was tense but focused. You don't have time to worry about the little things back home when you're running convoys through contested zones and monitoring border movements. My thoughts stayed mostly on my team, the mission, and occasionally, the life I was building for myself once I got home. That life included a quiet plot of land nestled at the edge of my old hometown in Arizona, about 1.5 acres of soil, some trees, and a whole lot of dreams. It wasn't much to anyone else, but to me, it meant everything. It was the last piece of property my grandfather owned before he passed. My dad never cared for it, but I did. I used to spend summers out there with my grandpa, helping him build the fence, picking up firewood, listening to stories about the war. When he died, he left it to me in his will. And when I joined the army, it became my mental escape, a place I imagined building a cabin on someday when life finally slowed down. So when that email came through on a dusty Tuesday afternoon, the subject line hit me like a punch to the gut. "Hey, you okay with the HOA selling your lot?" It was from Mr. Harris, a kind old man who owned the house across the road from my property. We weren't close, but he was the kind of neighbor who always waved, always mowed a little past the boundary line out of courtesy. I opened the message thinking it had to be a mistake, maybe some kind of misunderstanding, but the photos attached told a very different story. There were bulldozers tearing through the edge of my lot. Orange flags marked where trees had been. Cut surveyors were standing around with clipboards, and in the middle of it all was a giant wooden sign planted into the ground. "Future site of Evergreen Park Extension, luxury villas coming soon." I stared at the screen for a long minute, hoping I was looking at the wrong land. But I recognized the hill in the background, the old tree stump by the road, even the sagging part of the fence I never got around to fixing. It was my land and someone was tearing it apart. I didn't panic right away. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was just a mistake. Maybe the city or the county had mixed something up. Maybe it was temporary. But then I read Mr. Harris's note. They said you hadn't responded to the letters they sent. So the HOA declared the land abandoned. Voted on it last month. I figured you'd know, but it felt wrong. Wanted to reach. That's when the knot formed in my chest. Letters, I hadn't received a single letter. Not one. My mail was being forwarded to my sister while I was overseas, and she would have told me if anything important came through. Besides, how could I respond to letters I never got? And what kind of vote decides that someone's land is suddenly not theirs anymore? I logged into my county property portal, heart pounding in my chest. My name was still on the deed, but now there was an asterisk and a pending transfer status attached. A name I didn't recognize had been filed as the new applicant, backed by the Evergreen Park HOA. The date of the filing, just 2 weeks ago. Something was seriously wrong. I called my sister that night through an encrypted line. She was just as shocked as I was. "I've checked your mail religiously," she said. "Nothing from the HOA, nothing from the county, just regular bank stuff and the usual ads. If something important came, I would have overnighted it to you." That confirmed it. They'd never sent me anything, or if they had, they hadn't sent it to the correct address, which meant either this was a screw-up or it was intentional. I barely slept that night. I kept going over every memory I had of that land. A time my grandfather let me carve my initials into the back post. The hours I spent planning a small, solar-powered cabin. The promise I made to myself that no matter what happened in the army, I'd come home to something I owned, something that was mine, and now it was gone. The next day, I used my 10-minute satellite phone access to call our base legal officer, Fields. He was a sharp guy, not much older than me, and always professional. I explained the situation quickly, and when I mentioned the HOA had declared my land abandoned and filed a new deed, he whistled low. "That's not just shady," he said. "That could be a violation of the Service Members Civil Relief Act. You're deployed. Your property rights are protected under federal law." "I figured," I said, but they went ahead with it anyway. "Send me everything," he said. "Emails, photos, copies of the documents. I'll loop in the JAG office back home and see what we're dealing with." By the end of the day, I had an encrypted email thread going with 2 military attorneys and a civilian liaison. All of them said the same thing. It looked bad for the HOA. They never should have been able to vote on selling my property without court approval. And they definitely couldn't label it abandoned without due processes, especially not while I was on active duty still. It wasn't as simple as snapping my fingers and getting the land back. Legal processes take time, and I was thousands of miles away. What frustrated me most was the speed at which they acted. The HOA didn't wait for a judge's ruling or even attempt to reach me through proper channels. They just took it. I started digging into the HOA board. I learned the president was a woman named Diane Cartwright, a former real estate agent with a reputation for being, let's just say, overly involved. She'd been in charge for 6 years and had a habit of pushing through projects with minimal community input. Several residents had sued her over rule violations and misused funds in the past, but nothing ever seemed to stick. And now she had sold my land out from under me, likely to one of her developer friends. I could practically smell the backroom deal. The so-called abandonment claim wasn't about community improvement, it was about profit. The more I read, the angrier I got, not just for myself, but for every service member who'd ever been taken advantage of while serving their country. I had given up birthdays, holidays, and the comfort of safety so people like her could live in peace, and this was how she repaid me. She didn't just take my land, she disrespected everything I stood for. That's when I made one more call, this time to someone who owed me a favor, Major Bretson. He worked for the Defense Logistics Agency and had connections in multiple federal departments, including legal and land management. I told him what happened and didn't sugarcoat any of it. He listened patiently, then said, "You want legal action or something a little louder?" I paused. "Both," I said. He chuckled. "All right, sit tight, we'll make some calls. Let's remind your HOA who they just messed with." As I hung up the phone, a strange calm settled over me. I wasn't helpless. I wasn't out of options. I was a soldier with a voice, resources, and a long memory, and they had just declared war on the wrong person. Getting back to base after that call with Major Bretson, I felt different. Not angry, not exactly, but sharp. Focused, like I had a new mission. I wasn't just a soldier overseas anymore. I was a landowner under attack, and this time the battlefield wasn't a war zone, it was a courtroom. In the following days I assembled every document I could. The deed to the land, copies of my grandfather's will, property tax receipts, photos from before I deployed, even screenshots of the military orders that proved I was on active duty when the HOA made their move. I didn't know yet how this would all unfold, but I knew one thing for sure. I had to build my case before I got home. Captain Fields helped me submit a formal complaint through the JAG Judge Advocate General channels. They opened a file, flagged my case as urgent under the Service Members Civil Relief Act, and passed it on to a federal legal office stateside. This wasn't just some civil dispute. The HOA had messed with a federal protection granted to every U.S. service member. That was more than shady, it was criminal. The more we looked into it, the worse it got. Captain Fields brought in an quiet guy named Taylor, who had a background in federal property law and fraud cases. He dug into the Evergreen Park HOA's records, especially those involving land acquisition and sales. Within a week, he uncovered a mess. "They've done this before," Taylor said one night over a secure call. 3 years ago, they tried something similar with an elderly couple who lived 2 blocks from your lot. Said their fence was encroaching on HOA land and forced a buyout. They settled out of court. "So Diane has a pattern," I said. "Yep," Taylor replied. "Pushed the rules just far enough to stay out of real trouble, until now." He sent over minutes from the HOA meeting where they voted to sell my land. It was infuriating to read. They discussed my absence like I had just ghosted the community. One board member asked, "Isn't he deployed?" Diane's reply, "Maybe, we sent notices." He didn't answer. The clock ticks for everyone. They voted 4-1 to proceed with the sale. That single no vote came from someone named Peter Niles, the treasurer. I didn't know him, but I made a mental note to reach out when I got home. If anyone had a conscience on that board, it was him. Meanwhile, my cousin Alana had joined the effort back home. She was a real estate attorney in Phoenix, and when I told her what was happening, she cleared her schedule. "This isn't just illegal," she said, "it's reckless. They filed a quitclaim deed without your signature. That's fraud. They never had clear title. And if a developer's involved, they're complicit." She sent letters to the county recorder's office demanding they freeze the property transfer. She also notified the title insurance company being used in the deal. Once they realized the seller had no legal standing, they backed off immediately. The developer paused construction. For the first time, the HOA had to face the reality that this wasn't going to be swept under the rug. But Diane didn't back down. She held a neighborhood meeting to clear the air and pushed a new narrative that I had abandoned the land, that I had been unreachable for years, and that the community had a right to develop unused space for the greater good. According to my sources, she even hinted that I was unstable from combat and trying to cause trouble. That part stung more than I expected. Not just because it was a lie, but because it showed me who I was really dealing with, the woman who wasn't just greedy, but manipulative. She was already spinning this to paint herself as the victim, but that lie wouldn't last. A week before I was due to rotate stateside, something incredible happened. The Department of Justice sent a letter to Diane and the Evergreen Park HOA. It outlined the investigation into potential violations of the Service Members Civil Relief Act, real estate fraud, and civil rights infractions. The letter demanded immediate suspension of all construction and full cooperation with federal investigators. It was the beginning of the end for them. By the time I boarded my flight home, news had already started to leak. A local blog posted a short article, "Veterans Land Sold During Deployment, HOA Facing Legal Trouble." Within days it was picked up by larger outlets. The comments exploded. People were furious. Strangers from all over were reaching out, offering support. Veterans, lawyers, even people who had been targeted by HOAs before. It was like a community I didn't know I had suddenly showed up at my side. My return home was quiet, which was exactly how I wanted it. I didn't even go to my house first. I drove straight to the property. When I turned down that familiar road and saw the empty clearing where my land used to stand untouched, something broke in me. The trees were gone. The wildflowers I remembered as a kid bulldozed. The fence line had been torn down. All that remained was a leveled lot, scraped bare and marked with faded orange construction tape. But as I stood there, something else happened too, something powerful. I felt grounded. I was back, and I wasn't just going to reclaim what was mine. I was going to hold every single person who allowed this accountable. The next morning, I walked into the HOA office like I owned the place, because part of me still did. I had my uniform on, papers in hand, and a quiet fire behind my eyes. A young assistant at the desk froze when she saw me. "Can I help you?" she asked, clearly nervous. "Yes," I said. "Tell Diane Cartwright that the landowner she stole from is here." And I brought friends. She stammered something, got up, and disappeared into the back room. A minute later, Diane stepped out. She was in her mid-50s, overdressed for a community manager, with stiff blonde hair and too much perfume. She looked me up and down like she didn't recognize me. Then she forced a tight smile. "Mr. Walters, I suppose you're here to discuss the property dispute." "Dispute," I repeated. "Is that what we're calling it now?" She sighed. "I understand emotions are high, but everything was done according to the bylaws." "No, it wasn't," I cut in. "You filed a false deed, forged documentation of abandonment, failed to notify a deployed service member, and sold land that wasn't yours to sell." "That's not a dispute, Diane. That's a federal crime." The color drained from her face. I placed a legal envelope on the front desk. "Official federal orders, stamped and signed. You're under investigation. I suggest you get a lawyer, preferably one that doesn't play in HOA politics." She opened her mouth to respond, but I turned and walked out. There was nothing left to say. By the end of the week, 3 board members had resigned. The treasurer, Peter Niles, contacted me directly, apologizing and offering to cooperate fully. He handed over internal emails and meeting recordings that proved Diane had pushed the vote through without full disclosure of my military status. One of the emails even included a line from Diane that read, "He won't be back for a year. Let's get this moving before someone makes a stink." That line became the backbone of the federal complaint. My legal team, now joined by a military liaison, filed a civil lawsuit for fraud, unlawful property seizure, defamation, and emotional distress. But that was just the beginning. We also filed a motion to dissolve the HOA under state law and requested restitution for the land and damages. I was no longer fighting just for my acre of dirt. I was fighting for every service member who's ever been taken advantage of while they were away serving this country. And make no mistake, I was ready for battle. I didn't expect the neighborhood to fall silent so fast, but that's exactly what happened after I walked out of the HOA office with a copy of the federal order in my hand and the truth behind me. People stopped making eye contact when I drove. My curtains twitched when I walked down the sidewalk. Some neighbors nodded respectfully. Others pretended I didn't exist. It was like someone had dropped a bomb of guilt across Evergreen Park, and the shockwaves hadn't settled yet. But I wasn't done. The court had frozen all activity on the land, but that didn't mean the fight was over. In fact, it was only getting started. The Department of Justice had begun digging deeper into the HOA's finances, and what they were finding wasn't pretty. Alana, my cousin, was working non-stop from her office in Phoenix. "They're cooked," she told me bluntly over the phone. "One morning, there's misappropriation of funds, off the books, votes, and at least 2 other property claims that smell just as rotten as yours." Diane might have gotten greedy, but she didn't cover her tracks. The HOA under Diane Cartwright's leadership had apparently formed an expansion committee with zero transparency, no public votes, no signed member consent, just a handful of board members fast-tracking developments that funneled money into private contractors, many of whom turned out to be friends, family, or former clients of Diane. One name kept popping up: Whitmore Development Group. They had been awarded the Evergreen Park Extension Project, the same project that illegally started on my land. It didn't take long to trace the ownership of Whitmore Dev to Diane's brother-in-law, who ran a shell LLC registered in Nevada. Classic corruption. Hide behind a company named Fast Track a land deal and kick back profits to family. What they hadn't counted on was a military officer with legal firepower on their tail. It all came to a head one Monday morning, just before sunrise. I was drinking coffee on my front porch when I heard the rumble of heavy tires on asphalt. At first I thought it was just a delivery truck, but then I saw the convoy, 5 olive green military vehicles, unmarked but unmistakably government. One after another, they pulled up to the entrance of Evergreen Park and parked diagonally across the street, blocking all entry and exit from the main gate. Within seconds, men in uniforms stepped out. Not regular troops, these guys were clean, buttoned up, with government IDs clipped to their vests. One of them walked toward me with a clipboard. He nodded and said, Mr. Walters. I stood up. That's me. I'm Special Agent Connors with the Defense Property Recovery Task Force, he said. We're executing an order under Title 10, Section 987 relating to federal violations of the Service Members Civil Relief Act and unlawful municipal asset use, effective immediately. Evergreen Park subdivision is under review for potential federal repossession of HOA managed assets. I blinked. Repossession. He smiled slightly. Yes, sir. You asked for both legal and loud. This is the loud part. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They weren't just investigating. They were taking temporary federal control of all common HOA managed property until the investigation was complete. That meant the community clubhouse, the tennis courts, the pool, the management office, even the roads were now technically under federal oversight. Word spread like wildfire. Within 20 minutes, dozens of residents had come out of their homes in robes, flip-flops, and confusion. Some shouted questions, others took pictures. Then, out marched Diane. She stormed down the sidewalk like a high-heeled hurricane, phone in hand, fuming. Who gave you the right to shut down our neighborhood? She yelled at Agent Connors. He calmly held out a sealed envelope. Federal order, you may contest it through the appropriate legal channels. I am the legal channel, she snapped, waving her phone. I demand you remove these vehicles and leave immediately. Connors didn't blink. Ma'am, please step back. We're not here to argue, we're here to secure. I couldn't help myself. I walked right up beside her. Still think this is just a dispute, Diane. She looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. You've blown this completely out of proportion. No, I said calmly. You just underestimated who you stole from. As agents moved through the clubhouse and gated office, neighbors started asking questions. That's when Peter Niles, the treasurer who had voted against the land sale, stepped forward. He stood on the lawn and raised his voice over the chatter. Everyone, listen up, he said. I've kept quiet long enough. Diane and the board misused HOA funds, ignored legal protocol, and sold property they didn't own. This isn't a drill, this is accountability. The silence that followed was thick. A woman clutched her purse and whispered, "Is our neighborhood in trouble?" Peter replied, "It already is. But maybe this is the beginning of cleaning it up." I respected Peter in that moment. He didn't have to speak out. He could have let it all blow over and saved himself the stress. But instead, he stood with the truth. And as more residents gathered, murmurs turned to questions. What else did Diane do? Are we liable? Why didn't we know? That night, I got a knock on my door. It was the Jenkins couple from 2 doors down, retired folks. Both in their 70s. They brought over a casserole. The old-fashioned way of saying, "We support you," Mr. Jenkins said. "I served in Vietnam. What they did to you was unforgivable. I just wanted you to know you're not alone." That moment meant more to me than any legal win. The next day the media arrived. First local news vans, then regional affiliates. Reporters stood outside the entrance, capturing shots of the military, vehicles, the locked clubhouse, and the federal agents with clipboards. The headline read, "HOA faces federal action after illegally selling deployed veterans' land." Diane tried to spin it. She held a press conference outside her house, claiming the military was overreaching and that she had followed community rules. But when a reporter asked if she had proof that I was notified of the vote, she froze. Cameras captured her silence. The next day, she deleted her social media accounts. Meanwhile, I received notice from the Arizona Attorney General's office. They had opened a formal investigation into Evergreen Park's HOA under state RICO laws, racketeering, mismanagement of nonprofit funds, and property fraud. The weight of the case was growing, and it was leaning squarely on Diane's shoulders. Then came the class action letters. To former homeowners who had been forced to sell under similar shady tactics filed suits of their own. One was a widow who had been fined into foreclosure. The other was a disabled veteran who moved out after the HOA cited him for installing a wheelchair ramp without permission. I decided to call him. His name was Ray. When he picked up the phone and realized who I was, he said, "Man, you're the reason people are finally listening." "Thank you." "No," I said, "we're doing this together now." And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just about my land anymore. This was about every family Diane had steamrolled, every elderly couple she pressured, every soldier she disrespected. It was bigger than just me. It had become a movement. A week later, the court awarded me temporary full reinstatement of ownership over the land. The fraudulent sale was voided and Evergreen Park was ordered to place a public notice in local newspapers admitting to improper acquisition. But I wasn't stopping there. With Alana's help, I filed a federal civil suit naming not just Diane but the entire board, Whitmore Development, and the escrow company that processed the sale, without checking the deed. Damages: over $2 million, including loss of use, defamation, and emotional distress. And since it involved federal rights violations, there was no cap. When my lawyer filed the paperwork, he smiled and said, "We're going to make an example out of them." I wasn't smiling though. I was steady. This wasn't revenge. It was justice. And justice had finally arrived at Evergreen Park. The Evergreen Park subdivision wasn't the same anymore, and it wasn't just because of the federal trucks parked at the entrance or the yellow tape wrapped around the HOA clubhouse. It was the atmosphere. The quiet, tidy suburb that once held HOA meetings about garden gnomes and mailbox colors had now become the eye of a storm. And the storm had a name: truth. I spent the days following the court order rebuilding mentally and legally. My land was back in my name, but the fight wasn't over. Diane was still free, still smug behind closed doors, and I had no doubt she was plotting some kind of counterattack. People like her don't retreat. They stall, deny, and redirect blame. I'd seen it before, just not in my own backyard, but this time she didn't realize who was watching her every move. The federal investigators had started combing through HOA financial records. Boxes of paperwork were hauled out of the office. Hard drives were seized. One of the agents even uncovered a hidden flash drive inside a drawer labeled miscellaneous receipts. That drive, it held personal email conversations between Diane and the developers, messages that were never supposed to see daylight. I got to read them through my legal team. The language was blunt, arrogant, and damning. In one thread, Diane told a contractor, "We'll ram this through. The soldier doesn't even live here, he's overseas. We can call it community development and the board will fall in line." In another she wrote, "If we move fast, the lot will be developed before he even knows it's gone. It's not like he can stop us from Europe." That one hurt the most, not because it was cruel but because it proved she never once saw me as a person, just an obstacle to remove. A name on a deed. The DOJ forwarded the emails to the state's attorney general. That's when the heat really turned up. Diane and 2 remaining board members were served subpoenas. The HOA's bank accounts were frozen. The community pool, still half drained from the construction halt, became a symbol, empty, fenced off, and quietly decaying. I noticed that the people who used to whisper behind my back were suddenly a little more vocal. They started waving when I passed. One of the dads in the neighborhood even stopped me while I was walking the property line. "Hey, I just wanted to say thanks," he said awkwardly, "for standing up." Most of us didn't know what was really happening. We just paid our dues and trusted them. I appreciated the honesty. "Better late than never," I replied. Not everyone was grateful, though. Some of Diane's loyalists, mostly older board members, spouses, and friends, had started a private Facebook group too. Complained they called me a bully in uniform and claimed I was using the military to settle a personal vendetta. One woman, who used to host tea parties at the clubhouse, even said, "He's embarrassing the neighborhood just to make a point." She wasn't wrong. I was making a point, but it wasn't about embarrassment. It was about accountability. The developers, now exposed and under state investigation, pulled out of the Evergreen Park extension project entirely. Their legal team sent a letter attempting to shift the blame to Diane and the HOA, classic damage control. They claimed they were misled about property ownership and legal standing, but the emails proved otherwise. They knew. They just didn't care until they got caught. Meanwhile, I worked with Alana and a local architect to sketch new plans for my property. A single-story ranch with solar panels, a front porch, and enough space in the back for a fire pit and maybe a small garden. I didn't want anything flashy. I wanted it to feel like my grandfather's land again, peaceful, real, mine. But I wasn't allowed to break ground just yet. The subdivision was still under temporary federal management until the court wrapped up the fraud investigation. That meant I had time, and I intended to use every minute of it to make sure what happened to me would never happen to anyone else again. I began working with a veterans advocacy group that specialized in real estate protections. They helped soldiers who'd been wrongfully evicted, had homes auctioned off, or were harassed by housing boards while deployed. I told them my story. They asked if I'd be willing to testify before the State Housing Committee. Of course, I said yes. 2 weeks later, I stood in front of a room full of legislators, lawyers, and press cameras. I wore my service uniform not for effect, but because I wanted them to understand exactly who they were listening to. I didn't ask for special treatment. I asked for fairness. I asked for my land not to be stolen while I was fighting in a war zone. I asked for the law to protect me like it said it would. And if it can happen to me, it can happen to any deployed soldier in this country. I told them about Diane, about the forged documents, the fake votes, the silence from the community until the truth exploded. I told them how the land my grandfather worked for was reduced to a transaction on a spreadsheet by people who never once looked me in the eye. When I finished, there was a long pause, then applause. That it didn't change the past, but it changed the future. The committee fast-tracked a bill to add stricter requirements for property seizure involving service members. HOAs would now be required to get judicial review and send notifications by certified mail with military verification before any action could be taken on a deployed soldier's property. That small win felt bigger than the lawsuits, the headlines, or even the federal seizure. It meant something lasting back in Evergreen Park. Things were falling apart for Diane. One morning, a sheriff's cruiser rolled into the neighborhood. Diane, still clinging to her fantasy of innocence, was arrested in her driveway on charges of real estate fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to defraud a service member. she screamed. Of course, tried to claim political persecution, but no one listened. Neighbors filmed the arrest from their windows, some even clapped. And just like that, the woman who once ruled a gated community like a queen was sitting in the back of a police cruiser, clutching her designer handbag and looking like she couldn't believe the world no longer revolved around her. I didn't attend the arraignment. I didn't need to. The system was finally working the way it was supposed to. Over the next few weeks, the remaining HOA board members resigned. A special election was held, and for the first time in Evergreen Park history, residents voted to dissolve the HOA completely. The community would be managed through a city partnership until residents could establish a transparent and fair association, if they chose to. And me. I got a letter from the federal task force clearing my land for development. No further liens, no disputes, no interference. It was mine again, fully, finally. The next day, I bought a brand new shovel, walked to the middle of the property, and dug the first scoop of dirt myself. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to feel the ground in my hands again. I stood in the sun, wind on my back, breathing in the clean scent of freedom that had taken a deployment, a federal investigation, and half a dozen court battles, but I had one. And as I looked out over the acre and a half of land my grandfather once walked, I whispered to myself, this was always worth fighting for. By the time the sun rose over Evergreen Park that spring, everything had changed. Not in a loud, dramatic way, but in the quiet, steady way that growth always comes after a storm. The fences were gone, the HOA office was boarded up, and the subdivision no longer had a president barking orders about lawn height or mailbox paint colors. The community was finally free. I stood on the edge of my property, hands in my pockets, watching the cement truck back into place. The foundation was being poured that morning. It had taken months of legal work, soil tests, and planning approvals, but it was finally real. My new home was beginning to rise from the earth. Not just a house, but a symbol, a mark of survival, of justice. The land was mine again. But this time it meant more than a name on a deed. Across the road, a few neighbors had gathered to watch the work. People waved. One woman, a single mother, who used to be too afraid to speak up at HOA meetings, walked over with her daughter and handed me a plate of homemade muffins. We never really thanked you properly, she said, glancing toward the construction crew. You didn't just fight for your land. You saved this entire neighborhood from what it had become. I gave her a warm smile. It was never about revenge, I told her. It was about making sure nobody else was taken advantage of. Again, she nodded slowly. Well, it worked. After she left, I sat on a folding chair and watched the workers finish smoothing the concrete. A soft breeze blew through the open field, carrying the scent of fresh cement and spring grass. I could almost hear my grandfather's voice again, clear as day. Never let people scare you off your own land, boy. Once it's gone, it's hard to get back. He was right, but I had gotten it back. Every inch of it. Diane, meanwhile, had disappeared from the public eye after her arrest. She was currently awaiting trial, out on bail but under strict restrictions. Her name had become a punchline in the local news cycle. One outlet dubbed her the Queen of Condos, highlighting how she'd tried to turn a soldier's land into a shopping complex. Her allies had either turned on her or gone silent. No more tea parties, no more power. The state had moved forward with new legislation based on my case. The Deployed Service Member Property Protection Act passed unanimously, making it a felony to sell, transfer, or alter the deed of a deployed service member's property without proper judicial review and direct consent. It made headlines across the country. I did interviews on the radio, on local news, even appeared on a veterans advocacy podcast. Every time I told my story, I wasn't just talking about what Diane had done, I was warning others, empowering others. I even got a handwritten letter from a Marine stationed in Okinawa who said, I checked on my property after hearing your story. Turned out my HOA was trying to vote me out of a development deal. You stopped it, thank you. That meant more than any lawsuit win ever could. But the biggest moment came a few weeks later. A formal ceremony was organized by the state to honor the individuals who'd stood up for justice in real estate fraud cases. I didn't expect much. I thought I'd shake a few hands and maybe accept a plaque. But when I showed up, wearing my dress uniform and standing with Ilana under a big white tent near the state capitol, I was called to the stage and handed something that stopped me in my tracks: a Civilian Commendation Medal, the highest honor given to a non-combat action by a service member. The citation read, for unwavering courage and commitment in defending the rights of citizens and service members alike. The applause that followed was loud, sure, but I didn't smile until I looked over at Ilana, my attorney. My rock throughout the chaos, and saw tears in her eyes. Later, when the reporters cleared out and the handshakes were over, I asked her, did you ever think it would end like this? She laughed. I thought we'd win. I just didn't think we'd make law books. That night, I returned home to Evergreen Park. It felt different now. Safer, like it belonged to the people again. As I stepped out of the car, a few kids were riding their bikes down the newly paved sidewalk near where the developer's office trailer used to sit. A group of retired neighbors sat in lawn chairs, chatting freely without fear of being fined for noise or improper flag placement. Freedom looked a lot like laughter. And then came something I hadn't expected. One of the former HOA board members, the only one who resigned early on and cooperated with the investigation, approached me near the mailbox station. "I owe you something," he said. "An apology." I turned to face him. "You already gave a statement. That's more than most." He shook his head. "No, I mean for when we voted to approve the zoning change." I had a gut feeling something was off, but I didn't question Diane. I didn't ask for proof. I just signed a line and kept my head down. I figured, what could go wrong? I studied his face. He looked ashamed, tired, but sincere. "We all make choices," I said gently. "You made the right one in the end. That's what matters now." He nodded, and I could tell that weight had been sitting on him for a while. The next few months passed like a calm breeze. My home's frame went up fast. I helped install the porch swing myself, same style as the one my grandfather built back in the day. I even added a plaque to one of the posts for Grandpa, who knew the value of dirt. When it was finally done clean, modern, but with classic touches, I hosted a quiet housewarming, no big speeches. Just good barbecue, a few close friends, and one American flag fluttering proudly from the pole in the front yard. That night, I sat on the swing with a glass of iced tea, watching the stars blink to life above me. No more lawsuits, no more police lights, no more forged papers or bulldozers rolling toward what was never for sale. Just peace. Evergreen Park had started planting again, real flowers, community gardens, even trees where the condo foundation that had been cleared away. Kids played outside more. Neighbors knew each other's names again. It took a war to remind people what home really meant. Not fences or fees, just trust, respect, and a little sunlight in me. I found purpose in a new mission. I joined the board of the Veterans Advocacy Group and started traveling state to state, helping other service members fight back against illegal property seizures. We stopped 3 cases in just the first 2 months, one in Florida, one in Nevada, one in Texas. The fight went on, but now I was fighting it from home. One evening, a local reporter came by to do a final follow-up story. She stood at the edge of my porch, scribbling notes. "What would you say to someone in your shoes, just starting this kind of battle?" she asked. I leaned back, took a breath, and looked out across the land. I'd tell them, don't give up your ground, not an inch, not when it's yours, not when you've earned it. The law may be slow, but when it finally moves, it moves like thunder. She wrote it down as my closing quote. And it felt right, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't raise your voice, it's hold your ground. And I did. For me, for my grandfather, for every soldier still serving, trusting that home will be waiting when they return. The HOA thought they could erase me with paperwork, but I had something stronger. I had the truth, and in the end, the truth reclaimed every square foot of this land, just like I did. If you enjoyed this powerful true story drama, don't forget to like, share, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to Bright Reality for more shocking HOA stories and real-life battles for justice.